Hello, welcome to Train Signal. You're watching the hardware installation lesson of the CompTIA A+ training course. In this lesson, we're going to be reviewing the procedures for installing various types of hardware components into a computer system. What we're actually going to be doing is installing each of these different components one by one. And by the time this lesson is done, we will have built a computer from the ground up. Not only will you see how the hardware components get installed, but you'll also see how we wire up all of those components up to the motherboard. And by the time this is done, you're going to have a really good idea as to what steps you need to take to get a PC built from scratch. Before we start installing any components in the computer, it's a good idea that we get a good feel for how the computer case works and what types of features it has. So we're going to start looking at the case from the outside, and then we're going to look at it on the inside. Now, to begin with, we're going to look at the front of the computer case, and this happens to be the case that we're using for our demonstration. You'll notice that there are some forward-facing drive bays, and in these spots you can install devices like CD-ROM drives, Blu-ray players, DVD players, maybe even a tape backup drive if that's what you need. There's also a slot here for floppy drives. So on the inside there's going to be a place for us to mount a floppy drive so that it lines up with this particular slot. Now here's your power button for this particular computer. And down here we have some front-mounted USB ports and a headphone jack. So there's going to be a mechanism inside the case that is allowing us to mount those forward-facing ports. Now on the back of the computer, we have a spot for our power supply. We have a spot for our external ports that are embedded on the motherboard. We have a case fan right here that's installed on the inside of the case, and we have some vent ports right here, and these are installed by the manufacturer. Then we've got the external expansion cards, or our adapter cards. These are the different openings for the 4 slots that we have on this particular motherboard. And you're going to see what that looks like when we get inside the case. And then the last thing that you're going to want to identify when you're looking at your case is which of the sides is the one that opens up so that I can gain access to the inside of the computer. And that happens to be this side right here. Or if you're looking at it from this view, it's this side right here, this edge. And right here, this is the button that we're going to push down in order to allow that side to slide right off. So the beautiful thing about this particular case design is that it doesn't require you to insert or remove screws in order to get the side off. It's as simple as just pushing down this lever and the side will slide right off. Now in our first demonstration, we're going to start off by opening up the case and exposing the internals of the case. And we're going to go ahead and discuss how the case is laid out. And just like we did from the outside, we're going to take a look at the front of the case, and we're going to identify where the drive bays are. We're also going to identify where you mount the floppy drive as well as your hard drives. And then we're going to remove the front cover so that it's out of our way while we're installing our components. Then we're going to take a look at the back of the case, and we're going to take a look at where the expansion slots go. We're going to take a look at the port openings that have to line up with the motherboard, and we're going to take a look at the power supply bay. And then finally, we're going to identify where the holes are in the case that the motherboard itself is going to mount to. Where are we going to screw that motherboard down to the case? Well, we're going to identify those holes in this demonstration. Let's take a look at the inside of our case. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to remove the side panel from the computer case so that we can get on the inside of the case. If you remember when we were looking at the back of the case, there was this lever that released the side panel. So by pushing down on it, we can slide the side panel right off the computer. Now you'll see that there are several areas inside the computer case. To begin with, we've got the expansion slots right here, so you'll have things like sound cards and network cards, etc. will be all mounted into your expansion slots on the motherboard. We've also got places where the external ports that are embedded on the motherboard will line up so that we can get external access to them. We've got a bay for the power supply that's going to be mounted right here. We've got some front-facing bays for your CD-ROM drives and DVD players. And then there's another section here where we're going to be mounting a cage that holds the floppy drive, if of course you're using a floppy drive. And then there are a couple of areas here internally where we're going to be mounting bays this way for hard drives.
Now we also have areas right here where the screws go on, and this is where the motherboard actually mounts to the back of the case. And then we also have the front here that we're going to need to remove because we want to be able to mount some things and adjust them from the front of the computer. So we're just going to push down on this tab, and then the front of the case just easily comes off, and you can set that off to the side until you're done putting everything in.
Now it's time to mount the motherboard in the case. Now when we do that, one of the first steps we're going to do is we're going to orient the motherboard into the case so that we have an idea as to how it's going to sit. Then what we're going to do is identify where the mounting holes are. Some cases come with a bunch of additional mounting holes so that they can actually take different motherboards. So we need to find out which of the holes are going to work for our particular motherboard. Now, depending upon the case that you're using, you may need to insert riser fittings. That's what these things are right here. They're these little devices that screw into the holes that we're going to be using to mount our motherboard. And then on the top of these things, there's actually another hole here that the motherboard screw would go into. So they're just to raise the motherboard a little bit off the back of the computer case. But as you've seen inside of the model that we're using, all of the holes are like on a little mound, like a little pitcher's mound, if you will. So the motherboard just sits on those. So we're not going to need to use the riser fittings for this particular case. But different cases have a perfectly flat back, and that's where these little components here come in handy. Now we're going to position the motherboard so that all of the holes are lined up so that we can start to insert the screws, and then we're going to secure that motherboard to the back of the case by installing all of the necessary screws. Let's go ahead and see what that looks like.
Now the first component that I like to install in the case is the motherboard because it's the device that everything else connects up to. Now you'll notice that this is the back of the motherboard because we have all of the external ports here that are mounted on the motherboard. So we're going to line them up with the rear of the case. And we're going to make sure that each one of these is in their respective holes so that the motherboard is flush to the back of the case. Now you'll notice when it's flush that the actual holes that the screws go in are going to line up with the screw holes so that we can put them in. So let's go ahead and do that now. Now the screwdriver I like to use has a magnetic tip on it, which allows me to have a screw stay on the tip, and then I can go ahead and put a little pressure on the back of the motherboard while I'm lining the screw up with the hole. And then I just insert it. Now I don't tighten them all the way down because while I'm putting the different screws in, I want to have a little bit of ability to adjust the motherboard by pushing in on it. And then eventually I go back and I tighten them all down afterwards. Now I also like to do one on both sides, one on the bottom and one on the top, so that I have a little bit of security and stability front to back and top to bottom. And then I'm just going to go ahead and put all the rest of them in. So instead of making you watch me put all of these screws in, I'm just going to go ahead and do that, and then I'll get back to you and we'll join up again when I'm done.
Now that we've secured our motherboard to the back of the case by installing all of the screws, we're ready to now insert some of the different components that are going to be installed on the motherboard. And to begin with, we're going to install the CPU into its socket. So the first thing we need to do is locate the socket on the motherboard. Then we have to unlock it and open up the socket cover so that the socket itself is exposed and we can install the CPU. Then we want to orient the processor so that it's aligned properly. Once it's aligned properly, we're going to insert it into the processor socket, and then we're going to secure it by closing the cover and locking it down. Now that we've talked about it, let's go do it.
Now we're going to install the processor on the motherboard. The first thing we want to do is to identify the processor socket, which we have right here. And on this particular socket, we've got a locking lever, we've got a cover that holds the processor in place, and then beneath that is the pin grid array that the processor is going to make contact with. Now in order to get the processor mounted, we have to release this locking lever by pushing down on it, and then we can lift up on it. Once it's released, we can actually lift the cover to get it out of the way. Now what we want to do is we want to line up our processor, and down here on this bottom corner we've got our triangle, and that's going to be oriented down into this corner. So we're going to lay the processor into the pin grid array socket. We're going to let down the cover, and then we're going to lock it into place by pushing down on the locking lever. And that's all you need to do to install a processor into a processor socket. It's that easy.
Now let's take a look at installing RAM on the motherboard. In order to install RAM, first of all we have to locate the RAM slots on the motherboard. Once we've found them, we have to make sure that we orient our RAM over the slots so that the notches on the slots and the notches on the RAM sticks are lined up with one another. Then we're going to insert the RAM into the slots, and we're going to secure the RAM by pressing down on it and then making sure that the locking arms, which are the little nubs that you see here and on the other side, that they actually close up and lock down so they secure the RAM in place. Let's go ahead and install RAM.
Now when you're installing RAM, the first thing you want to do is locate where the slots are on your motherboard. These are our 4 RAM slots on this motherboard, and you'll notice that the locking mechanisms on some of them are white and on the other ones they're black. Since we're going to be trying to use dual channel capability, we want to install our RAM in both of either the white slots or the black slots. I'm going to use the white slots for this demonstration. So the first thing I want to do is open up the locking pins on both of them. Then I want to grab my RAM and I want to bring it in, and I'm going to line it up, and you'll notice that the notch here is lined up with the notch inside the socket. We stand the RAM up, and then you just come in with 2 thumbs and you give it a good push, and then the actual locking mechanisms will automatically close. Now we're going to bring in the second RAM stick and do the same thing. We're going to slide it into the socket, we're going to push down nice and firm, and then both of those are going to click into place. And you just want to give them a little push just to make sure that they really did lock in place so that your RAM doesn't come out. And installing RAM is that simple.
Now that we've installed our RAM, we're going to take a look at how to install the front-mounted USB ports. Now in this particular situation, our case has a unique way of doing it. This is the way that the manufacturer of this case has provided us with front-mounted USB ports. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to mount their USB frame onto the front of the case. We're going to secure it down with a single screw. Then we're going to insert the USB circuit board that actually has the ports on it into the frame. So we're going to be doing that from the inside of the case, and we're going to slide it in. Then we're going to secure that circuit board to the frame by inserting 2 screws. Once again, this is how this particular manufacturer has designed their case to provide us with front-mounted USB ports. Let's take a look at how we do that.
So here's the front-mounted USB ports and the headphone jack that we're going to be mounting onto the front of the computer. And this is the cage that it gets housed in. Before we install the cage, we have to remove the board on here that actually has the USB ports and the headphone jacks, and we're going to set it off to the side. Then we're going to mount this onto the front. There's a couple of little flanges you need to get through the slots, and then slide it to the side. And this is the way this particular case is designed. You're going to notice that other cases have different ways of getting components mounted to the front. I'm going to go ahead and just lock this one down here so that it's perfectly secure. Then what we need to do is take this guy and we're going to slide it in the back. And you're going to notice we've got 2 holes here that screws can go in. So I'm going to go ahead and slide it in and get it lined up with the holes. And once we have it lined up, we're going to insert some screws through the top here. Here are our 2 screws. And again, I just love this magnetic screwdriver because without it, this would be just about an impossible task. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get that one in. And I'm going to cinch it down. There we go. And let me get the second screw in. And that way we've got a nice secured USB port. That way when you're pushing your USB ports in, they're not going to be sliding back and forth. And this will just take a couple of quick turns. There we go. There we go, caught the thread. Perfect. Now we've got our front mounted case with our USB and our headphone jacks, and we're ready to move on to the next component.
Now we're going to take a look at how to install a drive into a drive bay. Before we talk about the procedure that we're going to follow though, there's a couple of points I'd like to make. First of all, the types of devices that you install into a drive bay could be a parallel ATA or a serial ATA device. It doesn't really matter. The interfaces themselves are going to be on the motherboard. We're just talking about a place to house the component itself, so it doesn't matter whether it's PATA or SATA. Now, the types of devices that you might install in a drive bay might be a hard drive, or it could be a CD-ROM drive, a DVD player, a Blu-ray player, tape backup drives. Now, usually your drive bays give you front access, and you're only going to be using it for components that you need to have front access with, like a CD-ROM drive, for example. But sometimes manufacturers will give you adapter cages and allow you to install hard drives in those spots so that you could use them for putting additional hard drives in your computer system. The only difference would be that you would leave the drive bay cover on the outside of the case in its place, so it would block the hard drive because you don't need to see it. It's only an internal component. But in this particular case, just keep in mind that your drive bays, while they're mostly used for forward-facing or front-facing components, they may also be used for other devices like hard drives. Now here's the procedure that we're going to follow. First of all, if it's a PATA drive, a parallel ATA, or also known as an IDE drive, we first need to configure that drive as a master or a slave. And we talked about that in an earlier lesson. Now, if it's a SATA drive, a serial ATA drive, we don't have to do that. Now, once we've done that configuration, we're going to locate the drive bay and figure out which position within the drive bay we want to install that component. We're going to orient the drive so that the power connectors and the data connectors are inward facing, because that's not the part of the drive we want to face out. We want all that stuff facing in. Then we're going to slide the drive into the drive bay and position it properly, and then we're going to secure it to the case by installing some mounting screws. Let's go ahead and do that.
So the IDE or PATA device that we're going to be installing now is a CD player. Again, it could be a DVD player or a Blu-ray player. Now, since it's an IDE player, we had to set this to either master or slave, and it's the only device that's going to go into this computer that is IDE. So we set it to master. Now, in order to install it, we're just going to slide it into the external drive bay. Now, you're going to notice there's a screw already in the side here, and this is a nice little trick that we like to do. Since this particular case has a bowing front, you want to make sure that the front of the devices you're installing actually line up with the front of the case. So by installing that screw and sliding it in, it won't let it slide in any further than it should, and now it's going to be perfectly lined up with the front of the case. And it aligns up the secondary mounting screw that we're going to be installing here in order to lock it into the drive bay. And now we're going to go ahead and tighten that down, and now this particular device is firmly installed in the case, and we're ready to move on to the next component.
Now we're going to take a look at installing drives into drive cages as opposed to a drive bay. Now, the big difference between a drive cage and a drive bay is that a drive bay is a part of the computer case. It cannot come out. A drive cage, however, can be removed from your computer case and then reinstalled back in at a later time. That's the only difference. Now, the types of devices that you can install in a drive cage, well, it can be parallel ATA, which is also known as IDE, or it could be serial ATA. Now, we also have the capability of installing floppy drives as well. Now, in our example, I'm going to be installing a SATA hard drive and a floppy drive into a drive cage. So you're going to see how those particular devices get installed. One of them, the floppy drive, is an external or forward-facing component. It has a slot in the front of the computer case so that you can put floppy disks in and get them out. The hard drives, however, are internal only. Now, some manufacturers make it so that all of your external-facing devices are being mounted in drive cages as opposed to bays. It really depends on how the case manufacturer does what they do. Now, let's take a look at the procedure that we're going to follow. First of all, just like before, if we're talking about an IDE drive or a PATA drive, if we have that type of component, we're going to need to configure it as a master or a slave. Now, in this particular case, our floppy drive is not a SATA or, not a PATA device, so we don't have to worry about that. And the hard drive happens to be a SATA drive, so again, we're not going to worry about that as well. But if it were, we'd have to do that step first. Then we want to locate the drive cage that we're going to use. Now the floppy drive cage is too small for the hard drive, and the hard drive cage is too large for the floppy, so you need to make sure you get the right cage for the right component. Then you want to orient the drive in the cage, and you want to secure that drive by installing the mounting screws that will hold that drive in the cage. Then you install the cage into the computer case and secure it to the case with some mounting screws. That's all you have to do. Let's actually go do that.
Now we're going to install hard drives in the case. Now in order to do that, this case comes with these hard drive mounting cages. And we would secure our hard drives into these cages by using mounting screws. But this one is empty because we've only got one hard drive to install and we've got two of these cages to use. So we're going to install the blank one first, and then we'll install the one with the hard drive afterwards. Now the way that we install them is we use these lips and we insert them into the slots that are up here. And once they're installed, we just rock this forward, and then the actual hole here will line up and we can insert a mounting screw. So let me just go ahead and get that all lined up for you. And then we're just going to go ahead and screw that in place. And now we're ready for the actual cage that has the hard drive in it. So this mounting cage actually has a SATA hard drive in it, and this is going to be the primary hard drive for this computer system. And we've got it mounted to the cage with two screws on this side and then a single screw on that side. Now this mounts into the cage, or into the case rather, the exact same way. We've got the two lips that go into these two slots right here, and we insert it like so. And then we rock it forward, and again we've got that hole. Now this has got a little bit of weight to it, so it's going to slide forward for a second. Hopefully it won't fall out while I'm putting the screw in. And we just push that back, insert the screw, and lock her down. And now we've got our two hard drive cages in place with our SATA drive mounted, and we're ready for the next step. And in this particular case, we could wire these up, but we're going to save wiring until later on. We want to make sure we get all of our components in place first, then we're going to get them wired up.
Now it's time for us to install the heatsink on top of the CPU. What we're going to do to get that installed is we're first going to install the heatsink bracket on the motherboard, and we're going to secure that bracket to the motherboard using the screws that come with the heatsink bracket. Once that's installed, we're going to install thermal compound on the top of the CPU. And then when we install the heatsink and we press it into place and we lock it into that bracket, the pressure that it applies to the CPU will spread the thermal compound across the surface of the CPU so that we get nice even coverage. And then we're going to end up by securing the heatsink itself into its bracket by installing some of the clips that come with that bracket. Now, each design is a little bit different. This particular design that we're going to demonstrate for you has these green clips that will help to keep that heatsink in place. Let's go do that installation.
Now, before I install the heatsink, I just wanted to point out something to you. You probably noticed earlier that our processor had some thermal compound on it because this was a processor that was in another computer. So what I did before this demonstration was I took the CPU out and I cleaned off the old thermal compound so we have a nice clean surface to put the new compound on. Now to begin with, the first thing I need to do is I need to install this bracket for the heatsink to be clipped into. And that's going to take 4 screws to secure it down. And I'm just going to put the screws in part of the way so that I can make sure that I can move the bracket around like so to be able to line up the holes with the screws. And I'm going to get this one up here in the top corner, that way I have a little bit of side to side and front to bottom stability there, so that ought to work out nicely. And I can go ahead and grab those other 2 screws and just pop them in. Then once I have all 4 in, like I do with these other things that I install, I'll cinch them down and make sure that they're nice and secure before I try to put that heatsink in. Okay, so there's the first one cinched down, and I'll go get the other 3 and we'll be all set to go. And there we are. Now, what I'm going to do at this point is put some new thermal compound on the processor. And I'm just going to put a little squiggly here in the center. And then that way, when I put the processor down, or the heatsink down on the processor, it'll spread that out over the entire surface of the processor and we'll get a nice even contact. Now here's the heatsink. What I'm going to do is I'm going to install it into the bracket by pushing it up to the top and then clipping it into place. and just pushing on each end to make sure that it's nice and secure. And the last thing I need to do is take these green brackets that will hold the heatsink into the frame here and just install them. There's one. The other one goes up top here like so. And now we have our heatsink installed to keep our processor running nice and cool.
Now let's take a look at installing adapter cards. Now, when we install adapter cards, one of the things that we have to do first is identify the type of slots that we need in order to install the adapter card. Actually, I think a better way of looking at it would be to take a look at the types of slots that you have, and then go buy the adapter card that you want to install based on that kind of slot. So for example, if I had PCI slots only, say all of my PCIe slots were already used and I had 2 PCI slots left and I wanted to add a network card and a sound card, I would have to go buy a PCI network card and a PCI sound card so that they can fit in those particular slots. So again, you have to make sure that the card type you're going to install matches up with the type of slot that you have available. Now, once you've done that, what you want to do is you want to prepare the slot for installation. So you're going to unscrew and remove the slot cover so that you have an opening in the back of the computer. Then you're going to take that expansion card and you're going to orient the adapter card with the expansion slot so that the slot and the edge of the card line up. You then insert the adapter card into the expansion slot, and then you secure the adapter card to the case by reinserting the screw that you removed when you got rid of the cover. Now, I would hold on to those covers, keep them somewhere in a drawer or in a bag where you can get at them if you need them, because if you ever remove one of your expansion cards, your adapter cards from that computer, you want to recover that slot again and resecure it with the screw. So that's how you're going to install an adapter card. We're going to go do that right now.
Now we're going to install our expansion cards. Now before we do that, I just want to review the different slots that we have in this motherboard. First of all, we have a PCIe 16X slot, we have 2 different PCI slots, and then we have a PCIe 1X slot right here. Now we're going to be installing a sound card in this PCI slot and a network card in this one. So let's go ahead and get the sound card installed first. Let me move this cable out of the way so it doesn't get in our way. Here's the sound card that we're going to be installing because we don't want to use the sound card that's embedded on the motherboard. We wanted to have a better quality sound card. So we're going to put that in the PCI slot here, line it up, and then click it in place. Then what we're going to do is install a screw up here in order to be able to secure it to the case. We want to make sure that all of the contacts that are seated in the slot always make proper contact. So by securing it with this screw, we actually stabilize the card so that it doesn't move around. Then we're going to install the network card, and it's this guy here. It's a little smaller in size, but it's still a PCI card. We're going to put it in the second PCI slot. And again, we're just going to line it up. We're going to lock it into place. And then again, we're going to take a screw and secure it to the chassis here, to the case. Sometimes you got to give it a little bit of a push just to line it up. And away we go. And now we've got all of our expansion cards in. Now you'll notice that in the slots that there are no expansion cards, we've got these covers here. It's important that you keep the slots that have no cards in them covered up this way for thermal purposes. You want to make sure that you don't have any additional airflow that you shouldn't have. These cases are designed so that all of the holes that aren't being used should be plugged up properly. So that's what these covers are for right here.
Now it's time to install the power supply. First thing we're going to do is we're going to locate the power supply bay in the computer. Then we're going to very carefully insert the power supply into that bay, and we're going to secure the power supply to the computer case by installing all of the necessary mounting screws. This is a relatively straightforward installation. Let's go do it.
Now here's the power switch that we're going to install with this case. Here's the switch itself, and again there's a couple of LED lights that we have that will tell you when the computer's on and working. Now we're going to connect it up to the case, and then later on we're going to use this connector here to hook it up to the motherboard. But for right now, let's just get it installed in the case, which is just taking this lower lip here and putting it here in place and then rocking it forward. That's all you have to do, and now you've got a power switch right here on the front of the case. Now we're going to do the power supply. Now this is a very heavy device, so you got to be careful when you're bringing it in. You don't want to accidentally drop it on your motherboard. So let's go ahead and just lay it into its bay. I'm going to let the cables just lay there for a moment. We're going to line up the 4 screws here that we're going to use to secure it. And sometimes you got to just move it around a little bit. There you go. Perfect. Now we've got all 4 screws lined up. Let's go ahead and secure that. Now when you're putting in your power supply, you want to make sure that you get all 4 screws in. Just because of the sheer weight of the power supply, you do want to make sure that it's really well stabilized and secured in the case. You don't want it shaken loose. So by putting in all 4 screws, you've got the proper amount of security there. And just pop that one in. 2 more to go, and our power supply is installed. And 1 to go, and we're done. Not hard. This is actually a pretty simple installation here. This is a pretty easy component to get in your case. All right, there you go. Our power supply is now secure. Our power switch is in place, and we're ready to go on to the next step.
Now we're going to take a look at connecting up the power cables. And we're going to break this into 2 different sections. The first one we're going to look at is the motherboard. Which power connectors from the power supply get connected up to your motherboard? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to locate those connectors. Once we locate those connectors, we're going to then locate the power receptacles on the motherboard, and then we're going to insert those power connectors into the receptacles so that the motherboard now has the capability of receiving power from the power supply. Now there is one extra step that we're going to do here. There are some components that are going to tap off of the motherboard in order for them to get power, because the power is coming from the power supply through the motherboard and then off to other components like USB ports that are mounted on the front of our computer case. So we need to find those power receptacles on the motherboard and install those as well. Let's go do that.
Now the motherboard has a few different connectors that we need to actually hook up to it so that it can get the power it needs. We've got the P1 and the P2 connector. The P1 is the primary connector that we're actually going to be hooking up. So I'm going to set this one off to the side for a moment, and let's get that one installed first. Now you'll notice that the socket that we're going to be inserting it into has a little notch here that's going to latch onto this clamp right here, and it's going to keep it locked in place. So let's go ahead and install that. It's very simple, and it's keyed, so you can't put it in backwards. It'll only go in one way. Now when you hear it click, you know that it's actually locked down. The P2 connector is going to go into this guy here, and again, it's got a little latch there, and we've got the clamp here. So by inserting it like so and pushing down, it's now secured onto the motherboard. Now there are 2 other auxiliary power connectors that you need. This guy right here is the one that goes to the main power switch on the front of the computer. And it actually has 9 pins on it, and again, with the little notch here, there's only one way that it can go into this particular connector right here. So we're going to insert it there and push it down. And this one here, which is also another 9 pin, is for the USB ports on the front, so it provides them with the power that they need. And it goes into this connector right here. And there you go. That's all that you need to do to get the motherboard powered up.
Now the second half of the power cable connection exercise is going to be to connect up power cables from the power supply to the different drives that we've installed. And in this case we have a CD-ROM drive, a floppy drive, and a hard drive that need to have power from the power supply. So again, first thing we're going to do is identify the types of connectors that get used for each drive. We're going to locate the available connectors on the power supply. We're going to orient those connectors with the sockets that are on each of those respective devices, and then we're going to insert them into those connectors so that those components can get power from the power supply. Let's go see what that looks like.
Now your power supply has several different connectors for connecting up power to different components. The first component we're going to connect power to is the CD-ROM drive here, and it uses these Molex connectors. Now we've already covered Molex connectors in other lessons, but just to reiterate, this is a 4-pin connector, and it's a larger one than some of the other connectors that you get on the power supply. and it orients this way, and here's actually where it goes into the CD-ROM drive, into the receptacle right there, and then you just insert. Now we've got the smaller mini connector that we're going to be connecting up to the floppy drive. And I need to move these other cables out of our way here so that you can see what we're doing. This is the floppy drive right here, and here are the 4 pins down here that this connector is going to mount onto. And it goes on like so. And then the final one that we're going to connect up is the final component here, the hard drive, which happens to be a SATA drive. And this is a SATA drive connector, and it goes on just like so. And now we have all of our components, the hard drive, the floppy drive, and the CD drive connected up to the power supply.
Now it's time for us to cable up our devices to get data from the device itself to the motherboard. So we're going to start off by identifying the connector types that are used for each of the different devices that we need to cable up. Then we're going to locate the appropriate connector on the motherboard so we know where the cable needs to go from the device to the motherboard. Then we need to find the appropriate cable that we're going to use to make that connection. Once we have the cable, we're going to connect the cable to the motherboard, and then we're going to orient the cable connector and connect it up to the device itself. Now it really doesn't matter whether or not you connect up the cable to the device first or the motherboard first, as long as both ends get connected. So let's go ahead and connect up our components at this time.
Now for this demonstration, we turned the computer case a quarter turn just to make it easier for you to see where I'm connecting things up inside of the case. I've got 3 different devices, my IDE CD-ROM drive, my floppy drive, and my SATA hard drive right here. So I'm going to start off by connecting up the SATA hard drive first. So here's our SATA data cable. And here is the connector on the motherboard that cable needs to be connected to. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect up the other side to the hard drive. There we go. And now that device is now connected up. Now in order to make it easier for you to see the next couple of devices, I'm going to go ahead and remove the power supply connector, store it off here to the side, and then I'm going to connect up the floppy drive. Now here's the floppy drive cable. There are 2 notches, so each notch has to be oriented with the notch that's on the connector that it's going onto. And again, we also have, as we talked about in earlier lessons, a twist in the cable because this is going to denote that this is the A drive. So I'm going to connect up this side to the floppy drive, this side to the motherboard. So let me go ahead and get that on. And let me just push that down, and now that's nice and firm. And here's the notch on the other end, and it needs to go this way. There. Now we've got the floppy drive connected up. Now the last device is the IDE CD-ROM drive. And here is the cable for that particular device. And you'll notice that there are 2 ends on this side of the cable and a single end right here. Now what I want to do is I want to connect up this particular connector to the IDE drive because we have an empty bay up here. And I want to leave this connector in the empty bay in case there's another device that we install later on. So I'm going to go ahead and install the cable. Get it firmed up there, make sure it's nice and tight. And then all I need to do is just take the remainder of this cable and just nicely feed it up here into the upper bay so that it's ready for that new device if we ever have one. The second side of the cable has to go onto the controller, which is on the motherboard, and here's the notch. So I just go ahead and install it like so and snap it down. And that's all we have to do to get that device connected up. And then finally we just have to kind of clean things up. We actually took this off in order to be able to see what we were doing, so we have to replace it. This is the power connector for the motherboard itself. And I'm going to come in like so. And there we go. And that's all you have to do to get your data cables connected up.
In this lesson, the last internal component that we're going to connect up is the cooling fan. The first thing we're going to do is identify the mounting location for the case fan. We're going to install the case fan on the computer chassis. We're going to locate the power socket on the motherboard so that the fan itself can get power. And then we're going to connect up that power connector that's coming off the fan to that socket on the motherboard.
Now we're going to install the CPU fan, and the CPU fan is going to be connecting up to the actual case itself. There are 4 little notches here on the assembly that have to go into 4 slots that are on the back of the case, and then it'll snap right into place. So let's get that positioned first of all. Now you want to make sure you get all 4 of them in place, and then you hear it click into place. Now it's secure. Now as far as power is concerned, you'll notice that there's a power receptacle right here on the motherboard up towards the edge, and this is the power connector that's going to go in there. All you have to do is just tuck this cable out of the way and then close the vent, and now our CPU will run nice and cool. Now that we've installed all of the internal components on this system, we're going to go ahead and button up the case by putting the side back on, and you'll notice that this just locks right into place. No screws are necessary on this particular case, which is why I really love this design. Easy to get into, easy to close up when you're done. We're also going to go ahead and put the front cover on as well, and once we're done putting on the front cover, we're ready to move on to the next step of hooking up external components.
Now that we've connected up our internal components, let's take a look at the steps necessary to connect up external components. The first thing we're going to do is identify the type of ports that are needed for each of the different devices that we want to connect up. We're going to locate the appropriate cables that we need, and then we're going to follow the manufacturer's instructions and perform the installation steps in the order that are recommended by the manufacturer. Some of these steps include things like installing software. It might be just device drivers, but some actual components come with software that the component needs in order to run, and that will be part of the software installation. You're going to obviously have to connect the cable to the device and to the external port on the computer. And some devices come with external power supplies to get their AC, and you're going to have to plug that in and then plug it into the AC outlet in the wall. And then eventually, you're going to, at some point in the install process, have to power up the device. Now, external devices are usually installed after the operating system is installed because you need to be able to install the drivers and have all of that new hardware recognized. The only exception to that rule is a keyboard, because a keyboard is an absolutely required component for a computer to even be able to boot up. And a mouse, if you're going to be installing the Windows operating system, is a nice device to have even during the installation process. So those are 2 components that you may install in advance of the operating system, but just about every other external component will require that the OS be installed.
Now the first external component that we're going to install into this computer is our networking cable. This is our Ethernet cable with an RJ45 connector, and it connects up to the network card right here on the back of the computer. So we're going to click it in place, and now we're connected up to the network. Now we want to connect up our mouse component, and this is actually a PS2 connector. This PS2 connector is going to connect up to this PS2 port here, and you can tell they're both green, so that makes it easier for us to figure out where we need to plug it in. And we also have our keyboard, which is also a PS2 connector. Now it's purple, and you can see the port directly above the mouse port is also purple, so we're going to plug it in there. And of course we need video, so here's our VGA cable, and this is our VGA port on the back of the computer. So we're just going to insert the VGA cable there, and we're going to cinch down these 2 screws on each side just so that we don't lose our video cable. We don't want it to come out of the port. Now you don't have to tighten them down too much, just thumb tight is perfectly fine, and that will secure that cable. Now the last component I'm going to be connecting up in this demonstration is a USB device. This is connected up to a USB external hard drive, and we're just going to pick one of the many different USB ports that we have available here. They're all pretty much equal opportunity, so I'm just going to go ahead and install it right here on this first port. Now that gets all of our external components connected, but none of this is going to do us any good if we don't plug the power into the case. So we want to make sure that we get AC to the computer. So we're going to go ahead and plug in that cable right there. Just give it a little push, and then we can plug the other end into the AC outlet on the wall, fire up the computer, and we're ready to go.
Now let's take a minute to talk about what we covered in this lesson. The first thing we did was we reviewed procedures for installing various hardware components within a computer. And actually what we did was we talked about each individual component and then we installed those different components within a computer system. So now you've had an opportunity to actually watch a computer being built from the ground up so that you can see how things go into the system. This knowledge is going to help you not only to build PCs, but more importantly to troubleshoot and repair them as well. So I hope you got a lot of good information and detail out of this lesson, and I think you're really going to enjoy the next lesson, so come and join me.